We're really fortunate today to have three people who can offer really good perspective on forest restoration. They're Wally Covington, Jerry Williams, and Rob Davis. And if you guys would come up and we'll get started. We're going to take them one at a time. Wally's going to start off. He is the Regents Professor of Forest Ecology at Northern Arizona University and the founder and director of the school's Ecological Restoration Institute. Wally and his institute are widely recognized as national leaders in ecological restoration and forest fuel reduction using restoration principles. He's got a PhD in forest ecosystem science from Yale, and he's authored many papers on conservation and forest restoration. And he's also a really good talking head for the media. Wally.
Thanks, Tom. I wanted to start out with just a little what the Ecological Restoration Institute is. The Ecological Restoration Institute at NAU is one of three institutes established by Congress several years ago called the Southwest Ecological Restoration Institute. What we've been attempting to do is to model state-level university, federal government, state government, county government partnerships that work to provide information and strong science support for ecological restoration of frequent fire forests. We have Ken Smith is here he's director of the New Mexico Forest Restoration Institute, the Colorado Forest Restoration Institute. Dan Binkley is the director of that institute. He was unable to be here at this meeting. So anyway, the Ecological Restoration Institutes have been operating and building toward the entire Rocky Mountain West. We kind of looked at two models for this. One was to have an institute that served this large area that shares so many common problems in forest restoration. And the other one was a state-by-state approach. What won out ultimately was starting with a state-by-state approach, see if we could make these three institutes work together, which we have been doing pretty well now for several years, to build toward a more region-wide approach to this. We have a couple of handouts on the table here. One of them is the 2006 annual report describing some of the performance measures and what we've done with the various streams of money that come into the Institute. The other thing that I want to point out, I'm going to finish up my talk with this at the end of it, is we have a summary of the statewide strategy for Arizona, for restoring Arizona's forest, and then we also have the full document. So some of what I talk about is going to be related to these. One of the things in trying to develop statewide or region-wide strategies, it's very important that they're based on broad input. We have, in Arizona, Governor Napolitano established forest health councils that developed the statewide strategy for Arizona, and my co-author, Diane Vosick, who's sitting right back here, is one of the co-chairs of that council, and Senator O'Halloran, Tom O'Halloran, is another co-chair of the council. Let's see, and then we have a couple of council members. Rob Davis is here, and Erica Rosenberg, there's Erica back there, was also on the council. I just want to recognize the hard work that all these people put in to try to develop ecological restoration guidelines and strategies that are explicit and deal with many of the problems that I'm going to talk with you about this morning. So I'm going to start out, I'm going to talk a little bit about ecology, I'm going to talk a little bit about economics, and I'm going to finish up with a bit on social, political context for ecological restoration of frequent fire forests. There we go. So I'm going to talk about where are we today in the Rocky Mountain West frequent fire forest. How did we get here? Where are we going? And what should we be doing about it? So where are we today? These symptoms of declining ecosystem health have been apparent since the early 1900s. first recognized by Aldo Leopold at a national level in the 1920s, shortly after he became a forester in the West. And these are some of the symptoms. The first thing we saw was population eruptions and population crashes. And these are population eruptions of typically trees in frequent fire forest. Once the fires that controlled tree populations were put out, then tree populations exploded. This caused crashes in grasses and wildflower populations. There's only so much water and sunlight to go around. So if you get a bunch more of one thing, you get a bunch less of others. The implications of that were really striking for wildlife. So we saw a shift away from open forest-dependent species toward closed forest-dependent species. One of the things that was really striking in Arizona is just the tremendous crash in pronghorn populations. And of course an eruption of things like porcupines and bark beetles. So this was one of the first symptoms. An increase in spread of invasive exotic plants. When ecosystems are out of whack, they're really vulnerable to invasion by exotic plants and exotic animals as well. Decreasing diversity, unnatural disturbance regimes, in particular fire and insects. Now these didn't show up for about 40 or 50 years after disruption. Frequent fire forests have these lags in their response to the disruption of natural processes. All of this cascaded through rural economies and rural social systems, which became in disarray, increasingly so. And so what we see is this spiraling decline in the overall ecologic and economic health of communities that are dependent upon frequent fire forests in the western United States. Well, I didn't mean to do that.
Probably easier just to private these
Oh, a little workforce training here. Okay, so one of the questions is, what is a healthy ecosystem, or what is health in general? And one of the principles that we have about whether you're talking about human health or social health or ecological health is that the system is self-regulating, that the system has all of its natural components and processes within certain ranges of healthy variability, or what we call natural variability when we're talking about ecology. So I'm standing up here, I'm cooking along at about 98.6. My blood pressure is about 115 over 60 or something. I barely stay awake. And so that's within the realm of health. If I were standing up here at 104 degrees Fahrenheit and my blood pressure were much lower than it is right now, I'd fall over. I wouldn't be healthy. You guys, someone hopefully had called the medics and get me in here, or you'd just kick me under the table. These same principles of health apply whether you're talking about ecological systems, economic systems, social systems, or our own bodies, wildlife population. All these same principles apply. Generally, in ecosystems, what we talk about as healthy ecosystems are ecosystems that are in a condition that's consistent with their evolutionary environment. So when that occurs, then these self-regulatory mechanisms kick in, and when little fluctuations in climate that occur, like we're about to see here, some big fluctuations in climate, the systems can adapt to it. And evolutionary processes can help the organisms track through time without catastrophic crashes. Enough of that. So what happened here? One of the things we know about frequent fire forest is that there was a sudden departure from natural conditions that coincided with Euro-American settlement of the western United States. The first major impact was overgrazing of western lands. And when you look back at forest policy, foresters, who tend to hate livestock, actually encouraged livestock because overgrazing by livestock, because it was seen as the lesser of two evils. By overgrazing, you could remove the grasses and wildflowers, which allowed fires to sweep across landscapes and get more trees. Fire was the enemy of the forest back in the early 1900s. And we see this kind of throughout by looking at fire scars. This is a cross-section of a tree that I took back in 1976 up at one of my research sites in northern Arizona. This tree has a center date of about 1370, which is down here somewhere. This is 1489. What you see on this tree, it was struck by lightning in about 1538. And then once it was struck by lightning, trees try to heal these wounds. And they produce pitch, resin, that tries to heal these wounds and keep bark beetles from infecting the trees. Now, one of the problems with that is that resin is very flammable. So when a fire comes through, that resin will ignite, it'll damage the cambium, and then you get what we call fire scars forming. So with this cross-section, you can see fires continuous up to 1876 was the last natural fire in this area. In 1877 is when livestock grazing began in a big way in the Flagstaff area. So fires stopped here, and there were no fires on this site until 1976, which is when we started prescribed burning these areas. So these fire scars are kind of taken throughout the western United States. And what we've seen, this particular site burned about once every 2 years for as far back as we can go, it was back to about 1200 AD on these sites. But we see generally in these frequent fire forests 2 to 10 year fire intervals that kept the forest healthy, open, and parkland. Okay, so when you eliminated fire, then several things occurred. This is one of the permanent photo shots. There's a good series of these. There's some right here in the Bitterroot Valley, good photo series, but throughout the western United States, we've got these in frequent fire forests. This is 1909. It's a long-term experimental plot. It's actually the first experimental forest the Forest Service established was at Flagstaff. This is 1909. These arrows are pointing to some trees that I'm going to follow over the next 3 photos. Here's what that area looked like in 1938. You can see the tree population eruption has begun. So in that previous slide, no trees in the understory. Fires have been burning through frequently, keeping tree populations in check. Then we have a tree population eruption. That's 1938. Here's the way it looked in 97. You can see these same 3 old-growth trees. The oldest one's about 600 years old in this group, almost 700 years old. All of these trees came in after fire exclusion. So now fires, we don't get natural fires. We get fires, as you all know, but instead of burning through the understory and being self-regulatory mechanisms, these fires climb up into the canopies of the trees and result in crown fires. And crown fires that get bigger and bigger and bigger as landscapes become more and more homogeneous as they fill in with trees. It's interesting, when I actually came onto the scene, started doing fire research in the West in the middle 70s, we really thought a 2,000 acre fire was a big damn fire. We thought that was huge. And then it got to be 10,000 acre fires, and I think most of us that were looking at it knew that we would cross that threshold to the 100,000 acre fires within a few decades, and that's where we are right now. Now, if it's only a 2,000 acre fire, no one gets excited. You can't even get a notice on the radio about a 2,000 acre fire anymore, it seems like. They have to be pretty big. So in looking at these fires, they're in the crown fires. In the 50s in the Rocky Mountain West, the states we're talking about in here, about 160,000 acres on average in the 50s. In the 60s, about 230,000. It's kind of a gradual. In the 70s, about 400,000, but a sudden leap in the 80s and 90s to millions of acres burned, over 1 million acres burned annually. And that's not finished yet. In 2000, we're still counting, but the intersection of these big landscape scale fuels with global climate change suggests that we're going to make another leap here pretty soon. And the best guess that we have is that what we're going to be looking at is about 5 million acres a year burning in the Rocky Mountain West until we run out of places to burn. At 5 million acres a year, instead of spending a few $1 billion a year, we're starting to spend 10, 12, $15 billion a year on fire suppression. So, just in summary, these changes that we've been anticipating have long been in the scientific literature. The lags tend to lull people into a false sense of security. The other thing that happens is that we tend to be accustomed to it. We get desensitized. On the plane ride out here, I was talking with Tom O'Halloran about this, and he had read through the material, and he said, I was surprised that the biggest fire in Colorado was only 140,000 acres. You know, we've got, of course, the Rodeo Chedeschi fire, 500,000 acres. Well, if you had told people in the 70s that we were going to see fires in excess of 100,000 acres in this type, they would have laughed you off the plane, probably. Now, the environmental impacts of landscape scale fires really are stunning. And this is a list, I'm not going to read it to you, but mostly we tend to think of it as just damage to houses. We tend to think of it a bit as fire suppression costs. That's a lot of money that we're spending on it. But we don't really do comprehensive economic analysis of all of these factors. There are a few people that have attempted some of that. We funded some through the Ecological Restoration Institutes. But the ballpark numbers that people come up with are a whole lot more than most people realize. Okay, so what can we do? Ecological restoration, I think generally people understand that this is what we do with degraded systems, that we try to restore natural structure and function in the ecosystems. With ecological restoration, it's important that it be based on the best available science. All too often, it's easy to just sit down and say there's a problem, let's just go out and do some stuff. You see this often with thinning prescriptions. In ponderosa pine is, I don't know, let's take out about half of the trees, or let's take out about 25% of the trees, or 80% of the trees, or whatever. But there is strong science that can lead us to what to do. I want to just describe to you, we'll look at one site with ecological restoration thinning treatments. And this is a prescription that we've used on several areas in Arizona, New Mexico, and Colorado. And first and foremost, it's retaining the old trees. Old trees are increasingly rare in frequent fire forest. They're rare because the old trees don't compete well with the younger trees. They're rare because they're very vulnerable to basal girdling at the base of the trees. The bark slough creates these mounds around the base of the tree so that when a fire burns through even a low intensity fire, it can kill the base of the old growth trees. So often what you get with prescribed burning in these forests is you wind up killing the old trees where the piles of bark slough is, and you don't kill the trees that you'd like to thin out from. So retain the old trees, retain sufficient post-settlement trees to recreate something approximating the natural structure of the forest, thin and remove excess trees, and then burn to emulate a natural disturbance regime. It's really important to not only change the fuel matrix on the area, but also to reintroduce periodic burning, surface fires. Now I'll just show you a little bit. This is one of the sites near Flagstaff. This area had a pre-settlement tree density of 23 trees per acre. Before treatment, what you see in this stand is over 1,200 trees per acre. And there's a little sliver of an old growth tree you can almost see here, and here's an old growth tree before treatment. I'm going to show you after treatment with arrows pointing to those same trees. After treatment, you've removed 1,190 trees. You've left about 2.5 times as many trees as were present in pre-settlement times. But the response is immediate. Old growth trees, which were on death's doorstep, start growing like teenagers. The understory vegetation just flourishes. Grass and wildflowers on this area was about 120 pounds per acre before treatment. After treatment, this is 3 years after treatment, it was almost 900 pounds per acre of grasses and wildflowers. And we started seeing then all kinds of wildlife showing up that were particularly rare in the area. before treatment. Now, another key point, I alluded to this earlier, is that it really does matter what you do. Alternative restoration prescriptions produce very different outcomes. I'm going to show you some of that quickly and just show you some of the quick back of the envelope, a little bit better than back of the envelope calculations. This is a full restoration thinning at a site up near Grand Canyon National Park. This is burning under the very coolest conditions that you could get. It's an October burn, about 70 degrees is the temperature, wind speed about 5 miles an hour. All these plots were burned at the same time. So here you see a restoration thinning with a fall burn, reasonable surface fire behavior. Here is a minimal thinning treatment, moderate thinning treatment, and this is a burn-only treatment in the fall. These two areas will both support crown fire. This area will not support crown fire. So what we've concluded from this is that although we tend to want to just go in and do gradual efforts here, that often what you can do when you take kind of half-hearted approaches is that you can actually create worse conditions. On one of the sites that we worked in at Grand Canyon National Park, we thinned no trees over 5 inches, a real minimal treatment. And that area under prescribed burning wound up killing all the trees that were left. It was much worse than just burning alone. Now, here's a table that I'm obviously not going to spend a lot of time on, but I just want to show you, that's just looking at fire behavior. So let's look at, this is, when I say replacement ratio, this would be leaving one tree, just reestablishing the tree density, the natural tree density. This is leaving 50% more trees. This is 3 times as many trees as would be naturally on the site. This is 6 times as many. Most of the restoration thinning treatments that are going in today in ponderosa pine are somewhere in this range. And what I was talking with you about before, this is the amount of heat generated in BTUs per square feet. With 1 to 1, it's 490. At 1 to 5, it's up to 670. You can still, that's still a surface fire, no big problem. But there are these thresholds. All of a sudden, when you get up to around 1,800 BTUs per square foot, 2,300 BTUs per square foot, it's a blow, it's a crown fire. We tend to focus just on the fire consequences of this, but what I want to show you with these next 2 slides is that there are other benefits from ecological restoration. Herbage production, very high under natural conditions, but again, a sudden drop-off at this threshold, at somewhere around 3 to 1. Stream flow, highest under natural conditions, and then a steady decline as tree densities increase. Scenic values I won't get into, but this is using scenic beauty models, but resistance to bark beetle outbreaks, very high under low densities, and then bark beetles, susceptibility to bark beetles increase dramatically as you leave more and more trees. Now, this slide, what I attempted to do with this slide is use the best available information to estimate the economic consequences of these alternative restoration treatments. So, the biggest factor, I think, so what I did is I took the changes that we saw from the previous slide. I looked at 4 million acres of ponderosa pine forest in Rocky Mountain. So it's a typical Rocky Mountain West ponderosa pine forest. And I looked at then the economic consequences of these treatments. These are in thousands of, in millions of dollars. So if you look at full restoration treatment with some very cautious assumptions about wood values, you come up with about $4 million with this treatment, about $2 million with this treatment. With minimal restoration, there's really no net wood utilization off of that. For forage production, a similar sort, about $5 per acre, about $40 per acre, about $27 million. With water, you see the water values. The wildfire savings are remarkable. So when you look at 4 million acres, the net benefit would be $11 billion of doing a full restoration treatment. And then it falls off as you do less and less. At $11 billion in 4 million acres, you can actually afford to do treatments that cost $2,000 or $3,000 per acre. We're really get good ecological restoration treatments for somewhere in the neighborhood of a few hundreds of dollars per acre today. So, what should we do? I think it's pretty clear, and there's a general consensus, that we need to increase the pace and scale of our treatments, of ecological restoration treatments. What Cass was talking about was increasing the amount of investment in ecological restoration treatments. The benefits of investing in this land, just if you look at the economics and not the long-term values of them, are substantial and far outweigh the level of investments that would be required. I think it's central that we insist on comprehensive ecosystem restoration, that we provide adequate funding and training to do that, and that we work collaboratively to design ecological restoration treatments. Without doing that, what we'll continue to see is blow-ups, social and political blow-ups. Now, this is a transition side, and I now want to wrap up with the statewide strategy as we developed it in Arizona. We used the same process in New Mexico in developing the statewide strategy for restoring New Mexico's forest and watersheds. So one of the things that I want to point out is that I think it would be much more effective for the states of the Rocky Mountain West to work in concert in developing a regional strategy for ecological restoration than to just go through and work at the state level. It's going to take a regional effort to restore these forests. It would be very inefficient to just try to attempt this on a state-by-state basis. And got ahead of myself, that's what all that slide is about. So here are some of the principles that we developed through both the New Mexico and the Arizona statewide strategies. Collaboration has to be an essential part of any of these plans for developing strategic ecological restoration. Treatment activities need to be planned at the landscape scale, and by landscapes I'm not talking about a few thousand acres, I'm talking about millions of acres. It's not working for us to treat 1,000 acres here and 1,000 acres there. That winds up being sort of boutique stuff. You know, you can take people around and say, isn't this great what we're doing, but when you look at it in a larger context, it's really having very little effect when we do it that way. Treatments have to be prioritized. This is where the collaborative process is essential. One of the things with the Flagstaff model, the Flagstaff Forest Partnership, working on it, when we started working on that 10 years ago, we assumed that people would want to have ecological restoration treatments southwest of town, which is where the fires come from. That's where you put in the restoration treatments. What the collaborative group came up with is putting the treatments northeast of town. And it sounds zany. You know, fires are coming from the southwest, why do you put them from northeast of town? Well, the collaborative group was more concerned about losing the Kachina Peaks wilderness area than they were about fires burning into town. So a lot of these things that we would think of, that sounds kind of crazy, why would anyone do that? We have to use this collaborative process, I think, to help to identify what's important to people. So in prioritizing treatments, the kinds of things that come up are critical wildlife habitat, critical watersheds, municipal watersheds, wilderness areas, recreation sites come out as very important. So what we need to do is, through these collaborative processes, prioritize these treatments at a large landscape scale. And then clearly the treatments should be based on the best science available. I think it's pretty clear from looking at the work that's been done in ecological restoration that reality-based treatments are better than treatments that are just pulled out of the air. So just to sum up then, these are the key points. I should have probably put this as the first slide. The forests of the Rocky Mountain West are in comprehensive decline, and the rate is accelerating. It's not going to be a gradual function. It seems highly likely with global climate change that we're going to see a major step within the next 10 years in decline of the health of the forests of the Rocky Mountain West. Nowhere is the risk greater than those in those ecosystems that are dominated by frequent fire forests. Ecological restoration offers a way to restore the ecologic, economic, and social health of the forests of the Rocky Mountain West. It matters clearly what treatments we do. We need to use the best information available to design these treatments. And then finally, from a social and political point of view, this is not, we should be distrustful, I think, of a bunch of scientists like me and technical folks sitting together and saying, this is what's in your best interest. We instead have to use a democratic, collaboratively based process to develop the policies and guidelines and priorities for restoring these forests. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thanks, Wally. Our next speaker is Rob Davis, and I think he's the only one here who packs heat for a living. He's the founder and owner of Forest Energy Corporation in Sholo, Arizona, that manufactures wood pellets for heating. Forest Energy is developing 2 new plants, one in New Mexico and one in Colorado, and they are a partner now in Future Forest LLC, which is the prime contractor for the White Mountain Stewardship Project in the Apache Sitgraves National Forest. That's a project that involves thinning 150,000 acres over 10 years. Rob has a mechanical engineering degree from the University of New Mexico, and he serves and has served on a number of forest and renewable energy related panels. Rob.
Good morning. I appreciate the opportunity to talk, and hopefully I can give you a little bit different perspective on what we're doing and the way we're looking at things. As was said, we're doing some work in primarily in Arizona, but also in New Mexico and Colorado, so we have a little bit of a variety of perspective, although most of it has been primarily ponderosa pine forests. I guess the first thing we look at, and it seems like we're the only ones over the years that have been looking at this as not necessarily a problem of how do you get rid of waste, but it's a problem of people recognizing that this resource that we have is an extremely valuable resource. We just haven't figured out quite how to use it yet. I mean, it's valuable from the standpoint of the trees, from the animals, from the watersheds. The whole forest as such is just an extremely valuable resource. And I think in what we're doing with the stewardship contract in Arizona, that's what we're trying to acknowledge and trying to figure out ways that we can utilize all of that value and that resource. So it is limited, and we need to really find the most prudent uses, not just for the products that come out of it, but for the water that comes out of it, for anything that it has to do with the air that it has an effect on. I do think we have pretty much an unusual opportunity right now in the United States. I think we're recreating forest policy and we're recreating energy policy. And in our way of thinking, we don't see how you can separate the two. We have a huge resource, and we need to decide exactly how it is that we want to utilize that. I think a lot of the things as far as looking at those two things, looking at energy, looking at forests, it was stated last night that we need some honest politicians to tell us what we need to do and we need to hear the truth. And I think that's true. There's a lot of things with energy that we have to change. And we just look at the forest as one component of that. One of the things looking at are things like buildings like this that are heated with natural gas, basically by boiling water. It's pretty easy to do very economically and very cleanly with wood. But we tend to, that third of our energy that's used for heating, all of our energy policy tends to ignore. That 60% of our energy from natural gas that's used for heating, we tend to ignore. Gas is becoming more limited. Gas is getting more expensive. We're importing more gas than we ever have. Gas can generate electricity at 60-65% efficiency, whereas wood does it at 20 or 24% efficiency. But we incentivize generating electricity with wood and not displacing this natural gas with wood and using it to generate electricity. So changes need to be made, and what we're doing with the forest and with the stewardship contract and with the restoration is a major part of that. We really need to look at creating solutions and not creating more problems. A lot of that was alluded to by Wally as far as some of the things that you do really create worse situations. So we need to not create those worse situations. We need to create things that are sustainable. We do tend to look at things not from the point of view of how do we get rid of this problem we've got and then we can forget it, but we want something that's sustainable. This resource we have is sustainable, it is renewable if we treat it correctly. And I think one of the big things we've always kind of thought that half the time we can't see the forest for the trees, but I think when we start looking at these policies, we need to see the world environment as well as we do just the forest. Because what we do in the forest has a major effect on, it can have a major effect, it can have a major benefit to global warming or to climate change or those types of things, to air pollution issues. So those are the things that we need to consider. I think in the next few years we have some choices to make. One of the choices is what are we going to do in the forests? It's not cut and dried. There's a lot of different opinions. I don't think, I guess what we look at is we should be optimizing. We should optimize all of those potential resources that are coming out of the forest. How we do that isn't an easy task. But optimizing doesn't mean that we leave the maximum number of trees in the forest, and it doesn't mean we remove the maximum number of trees from the forest. It means we optimize so that both situations work appropriately. I think the next question is how we're going to pay for this, which has been touched on quite a bit. One of the biggest things with the stewardship contract is there just isn't enough money. We could be doing more work, but there just isn't the funding available, and there won't be. You know, the funding is going to decline in our opinion. It's not going to go up. So we have to find better ways to utilize this material. The material that we remove from the restoration projects in Arizona, about 45 to 50% of that is under 5-inch. About 15% is 12 to 16 inch. The rest of it's in between. We remove virtually nothing over 16-inch. That means we've got a tremendous volume of wood that's under 5-inch DBH. And so that doesn't lend itself to any conventional products, but it does lend itself to energy products. And so then it becomes a matter of how do we get the highest value out of that wood? The forest here will be somewhat different. The forests in Colorado are somewhat different. But we still have to look at the same that was mentioned earlier. We have to look at those highest values. If we can get a good product out of it, a 2x4, a pole, or something, it goes there. That's exactly what happens with it. Anything we can do that gives us higher value on that. And it's the same way we look at it. We've got some large power plants, standalone biomass power plants going in near us in Arizona, which we're somewhat opposed to because they can't pay for the wood. It's not a higher value product that's going to help us if they have a huge thermal component and can use that heat to go someplace else. It becomes far more economical. But if we're just going to build standalone biomass power plants, as far as our perspective in trying to find the highest value for this wood, that is not a solution. That actually creates more of a problem. It's one of those, it's a 24 megawatt plant that we're seeing built. It is going to be a big sucking sound. It's going to need a lot of wood, and it's not going to want to pay for it. So we see that as an obstacle. It really is a matter of looking at all of the things and looking at the highest outcome, the highest and best outcome for the forests, and utilizing the residues to help to pay for that. Utilizing recreation revenues potentially to help to pay for that. But the economics are going to be very difficult. Most of you are probably familiar, Western Governors Association had a biomass task force that looked at energy generation in the western states and what was capable a possibility that we could generate from the biomass. Unfortunately, at the first meeting, they took a vote that said anything we decide in this meeting, we're never going to revisit. And the second thing they decided was they were only going to look at standalone biomass electric plants. So there is a little sidebar on the report that said, oh, there may be better and higher values that this wood can be used for. But that wasn't what the report showed primarily. The other thing I think that we consider and look at is with some of these, there's a huge volume of wood out there, and that huge volume that may need to come off today isn't going to be the sustainable volume long term. So if we size things today for the wood that's going to come off in the next 10 years or 15 years, we also should look at these facilities to utilize that as sunsetting, because some of those are going to have to, or we'll be right back to where we were before, that this tail is wagging the dog, and this plant that needs wood to generate electricity is demanding more wood that's going to be available long term out of the forest. Because in Arizona, the areas that are being restored in 10 or 15 or 20 years, even if there are re-entries for thinning, you won't have nearly the same volume. We won't get back up to the 800, 1,000, 1,200 trees per acre of the size that we have now that we're thinning. So it's another thing that needs to be considered in how we formulate policy. I guess back a little bit on the electric, it's interesting in that electricity now, when you're generating from biomass, gets production tax credits, and they get renewable energy credits, and they get accelerated depreciation, and they still can't pay for the wood. Thermal energy doesn't get anything. Arizona is the only state that about middle of August, actually, the new renewable energy standard went into effect, and thermal energy is also included in that renewable energy standard. So in other words, if you displace so many therms of fossil fuel, you get a renewable energy credit, whether it comes from electricity or whether it comes from thermal. The difference is thermal uses that resource at 80 to 90% efficiency. Electrical uses that resource at 20 to 24% efficiency. But our policies, both statewide and nationally, have steered us in a direction where we have these large companies that are looking at big power plants, because there are production tax credits, and it's scheduled to go up to an even higher rate than it was. And there are renewable energy credits, and there will be carbon credits. It's interesting in the fact that this wood resource that we have, it's like we're the only country in the world that doesn't use that resource. And that's literally, because we have wood in the U.S. going to Europe from both coasts. We have wood in the U.S. going to Japan to be utilized as energy, whereas we don't have a market for it here. So we have a resource, and it's just a matter of implementing things that level that playing field so the best things actually come out on top. The best things are achieved as opposed to what we've selected ahead of time that we want to happen. Like I say, if you want to generate more electricity, displace natural gas and generate electricity with natural gas. It's far more efficient. So as far as the White Mountain Stewardship Contract is concerned, it's been a really good start. It's not smooth, but it's been a good start. But I by no means would term it a success yet. There's so many aspects of that contract that we still need to see accomplished. The collaborative aspect has been remarkable. We've had, it's just amazing to talk to people in other areas of the country and then look at what we're doing in Arizona, New Mexico, and even doing now in Colorado. The way people are talking to each other, and the way things get resolved, and the way you can get 100,000 acres through NEPA without an appeal, and if there's a problem, people just start calling each other and say, let's get this resolved, as opposed to litigation. And that's been pretty satisfying. And we by no means agree on everything, not close. But we agree on far more than we disagree on, and so we're getting a lot done on the ground. So there is consensus, and we are finding solutions. And we are getting some solutions implemented, but we're still looking for solutions. And those solutions are, how do we find more value? How do we find a way to pay for this restoration? As Dr. Covington said, this is something that we need to get done sooner than later. And the money is just not going to be there unless we find uses for this material. we named the company that has the stewardship contract Future Forest. And that was for a reason, because what we were looking at is trying to create the situation that would show us what our future forests are going to be, how we're going to deal with them, how we're going to manage them, how we're going to use them, what we're going to utilize, what we're going to leave in the forest. And that means we've got to, especially in the Southwest, we've got relatively low-value ponderosa pine and small diameter. We've got to figure out different ways of doing it, and we still are. We're still trying to figure out how you get small volumes of wood through a large volume wood sawmill economically. We haven't figured all of that out yet. But those higher value products are something that have to come. And there is progress. There's things happening. There are new products being made. There's new processes that have been implemented. We have gotten some new pressure treating processes in that are doing a variety of different things, not just processes for landscaping ties, but processes actually that do different things, fire suppression or fire retardant. So there are things happening, and it is a process, but I wouldn't say we're quite a golden success story yet, but it certainly is a good start. I guess the main goal is that we want to be sure that we get to where we have a sustainable method of managing these forests. And we have that economics is something where it's kind of like Wally was saying, where we get it to where in this range where it will take care of itself, where we don't have to have input from someplace else, money from someplace else to do this. So yeah, the restoration economy is here, and I think there's a lot of work to be done, and I think there's a lot of benefit as long as was said earlier, it's not the big companies. It's community-based, it's small businesses, it's small plants, it's the type of thing that is going to be there in 20 or 30 or 40 years and not just there for 10 years and leave. And so we're real happy with being a part of that, and we would hope that we could see policy move in a direction that would incentivize the best solutions rather than the ones that people seem to think is what we want down the road. Thanks. Good job.
Jerry Williams is our final panelist. He's got the perfect deal. He's associated with the Brookings Institution in Washington, D.C., but gets to live here in Missoula. Jerry was with the Forest Service for many years and finished his career as the National Director of Fire and Aviation Management. Like many people in the Forest Service, he began as a wildland firefighter. He served as a smoke jumper for 7 years and in fire-related supervisory and management positions at the district, forest, regional, and national office levels. And he's worked with state and federal fire management organizations around the United States and abroad. He's got a master's in forest fire management from the University of Washington and a Bachelor of Science degree from Lewis and Clark College. Jerry.
Good morning. A couple of weeks ago, I was asked one of the classes up here at the university, it's a geography class, and they asked if I'd come up and talk a little bit about fire in the northern Rocky Mountains and so forth. And I asked the instructor, I said, well, how many kids are in this class? How many students? Oh, about 250, big auditorium. I said, holy cow, what are your expectations in a 50-minute presentation? And she looked at me and she says, if the first 6 rows don't fall asleep, you'll have done pretty good. I'm kind of resisting that becoming a new standard. I want to talk this morning a little bit from my perspectives as a fire director with the U.S. Forest Service and having spent a full life, adult life in fire management. I want to talk a little bit about the complexities that I see in restoring fire-dependent ecosystems. I'm going to build or reinforce on much of what Wally and Rob have talked about. I believe a new reality is gripping the West. Since 2002, 6 of the 11 western states have suffered the largest, most catastrophic fires in their respective states' histories. One of those states, California, has managed to do it twice since 2002. Now, that's remarkable when you consider that California probably fields the largest fire department in the world, certainly the largest fire department in the United States, at $3.1 billion, that's with a B, $3.1 billion per year in fire preparedness between federal, state, and local cooperators. In 2003, the Cedar Fire in Southern California, Cleveland National Forest, killed 22 people and destroyed 3,600 homes. When we think about that in today's environment, I'm reminded of the 9/11 Commission's report, and I know many of you have read that. One of the major findings that the 9/11 Commission faulted the federal government for was a failure to imagine. And as we stand on the cusp of this new reality, when Wally talks about what the future might look like in terms of wildfire size and severity, we've got to challenge ourselves. Are we imagining what could befall us if we don't get serious about restoration? The costs of federal wildland firefighting have climbed sharply in the last decade. They now approach $2 billion per year. Some projections start to peg this at $4.3 billion a year just within the U.S. Forest Service. In 2007, this last year, fire management needs in the Forest Service accounted for half, close to half, of the total Forest Service budget. In point of reference, in 1990, the fire management program in the U.S. Forest Service accounted for just under 15% of the total Forest Service budget. In a zero-sum budget, the firefighting costs now in the U.S. Forest Service are displacing other funds for water, wildlife, wilderness, recreation, all those things that define the Rocky Mountain West. If there's a question about the amount of spending that's going on in fire management and what it means, it's got to be referenced, I think, in that context. And I know Dr. Mosley talked about that this morning. In this era where firefighting capability has never been better and technology has never been greater and suppression funding has never been higher, what in the world is going on? That was a question as a fire director I got asked lots of times when they yarded me up on the hill and started asking questions about where is your budget going? You folks are out of control. In a recent op-ed piece in the Missoulian, Bob Much, a fellow that lives here in town, highly respected wildland fire scientist, he reminded us that despite all the concerns, all the fear, all of the arguing, and all of the blame that's reflected in recent letters to the editor, these forests are fire adapted. In fact, they're fire dependent. And I want to suggest that although fundamentally this is an irrefutable fact that defines the Western landscape, it's not yet taken hold in the Western mindset. Wally described the changes that have occurred in these forests. In their history, overgrazing and fire exclusion and high-grade logging have all contributed to an altered ecological condition that's left these once resilient forests vulnerable to high-intensity, severe burning. Today, much blame is aimed at those past practices, but I want to suggest it's more complicated than that. For all that we might blame these past practices, let me suggest it's our own behaviors, our own values, and our own inaction today that also is playing a significant part in their decline. You know, I'm struck by examples that Wally and Rob offer in parts around the country where we're making good progress. But elsewhere throughout much of the West, it is, in my mind, our own present practices, our own values, our own behaviors, and our own perceptions that's actually fueling some of today's worst wildfires. I also want to suggest that this isn't just a fire policy issue. It's a much larger, much more complex land management issue and land use issue. In my view, the root cause of these severe wildfires traces largely to our misplaced expectations for these fire-dependent forests, how little we understand their ecological dynamics, and how little we incorporate their ecologies into their management. Any restoration strategy that hopes to restore at a rate faster than these forests are declining is going to have to address the causal factors that's fueling this problem. Scientists like Bob Much will tell us that fire-dependent forests are arrayed along a moisture-temperature gradient and are comprised of different fire regimes. Fire perturbations occur in these fire regimes at different intensities, different frequencies, and different durations. These distinctions make one fire regime unique from the next. In fact, the kind of fire behavior that would have one fire regime flourish may in fact very well damage another. Water cycles, energy cycles, nutrient cycles, and carbon cycles are all part and parcel to a forest's health, resilience, and biodiversity. And although we don't readily see those processes, it's tied to the characteristics that define these disturbance regimes one from another. We're getting a little complicated with the science, but I emphasize this bit of fire ecology to provide a little insight into the complexities that will be involved in restoring fire-dependent forests. Simply said, a fix in one fire regime won't likely fix another, and in fact, it may introduce problems we hadn't imagined. In mid-career, my first assignment back in Washington, D.C., we lived in a townhouse development. One of our neighbors was an analyst for the CIA, and we got to be friends, and we'd take walks together over the weekend, and I'd tell him all the Forest Service secrets, and he never told me any CIA secrets. But he left me a bit of wisdom that I think I hope to never forget. He said, you know, in his business, the two most common mistakes they made were, number one, a failure to fully understand the complexities and the dimensions of the problem in front of them, and two, failing to anticipate the problems that their solution might bring. Today we hear broad, dominant themes that would correct the West Fire problem. Get serious about firefighting, develop bigger air tankers, bring on more contract firefighters, spend more money on fire suppression. Think about this. The U.S. Forest Service today enjoys a close to 99% success rate in initial and extended initial attack. Most of the wildfires that the Forest Service deals with are attacked quickly and put out quickly. But the 1 or 2% that get away or are somehow overlooked account for about 95% of the total acres burned and about 85% of the total suppression expenditures. How much more would we spend fighting fire, and to what benefit? In the past decade, for certain, we have seen some wildfires that we simply can't control until we get a break in weather or a break in fuels. In this context, now, at these rates of expenditure, I believe we are clearly on the margins of cost effectiveness, if suppression is the answer. before you dismiss that as just being foolhardy, I'm reminded of a observation from Roger Kennedy warning the country about the fire industrial complex, tailored after what Eisenhower called the military industrial complex, where the business of firefighting has become so lucrative that we may be in danger of becoming the tail that wags the policy dog. It's an easy solution to a complex problem that in a lot of people's minds, knowing nothing about the ecology of the systems, knowing nothing about where these systems are going, sounds like a pretty attractive option. Here's another theme. Protect people's homes and property at the interface and just let the rest burn. Some 8.4 million homes, they tell me, have been built at the interface nationwide just in the 1990s. Again, Roger Kennedy, in a recent book, comments that fire crews are rushing to keep pace with construction crews in the West. I don't know if there's a politician alive who would go along with simply writing off someone's home or vacation cabin in order to save a forest, even if that forest might represent a larger community's watershed, their viewshed, the place where they spend time. The political reality in this new reality is that the protection of lives and property comes first. Never mind that development at the wildland-urban interface is largely unconstrained, is often insured, and is affecting the larger condition of public lands. Few local planning commissions in the West, in my opinion, effectively manage growth at the interface. Some, in fact, encourage sprawl as a means to boost the property tax base and cover demands for increased services. In another recent Missoulian op-ed piece, the author asked, is it right for the majority of the state's taxpayers who already pay for fire protection see a substantial increase in taxes to go for suppression for a small segment of the population who chooses to live in fire-prone areas with few or no regulatory controls. Despite development in these places, there aren't many rural fire departments that can keep pace with the rate of growth. The insurance industry and, in my mind, FEMA both play a role in reinforcing this problem, and in a restoration context have got to be a part of solving the problem. The other theme I hear a lot of is use prescribed fire more or let more wildfires burn. After all, these are fire-dependent forests. They need fire. Let her rip. There's no question that in order to restore fire-dependent forests, we need to be using fire a lot more, especially in the West. In 1999, the Government Accounting Office challenged the Forest Service to develop a plan that would deal with overaccumulated fuels in the West. They saw that as the greatest threat to national forests. A fellow named Lyle Lafferty and I co-led the response to that report. Following analysis that weighed trade-offs between treatment costs and threats to people and watersheds and wildlife, the Forest Service answered with a figure that would treat 3 million acres a year just in the West, just in short interval fire-dependent systems, and maintain that level of treatment for 15 years. That was the minimum, at a cost of about $650 million a year. The plan went nowhere. Costs first emerged as the concern, but I'm not sure even today that money was ever the limiting factor. By the way, $650 million a year starts to sound like a bargain in today's suppression expenditures. But I don't know that money was the only limiting factor. In my mind, the laws that govern the management of the national forests simply favor no action over action. Perhaps contrary to widespread belief in this era when disturbance regimes are beginning to really light up in response to a changing climate, we are now seeing that there is a consequence to no action. This notion of do no harm is closely tied. Doing nothing is least harm. I'm not certain that wildfires should continue to be excused from scrutiny under provisions of the laws that govern management of national forest system lands. Let me explain that. In a way, some might believe it's right that wildfires do our work for us. In a way, it's attractive that they might. Internally, they don't require voluminous plans or NEPA. They're exempt from the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, and although they might require some consultation, they don't require extensive analysis under the Endangered Species Act. Politically, though the costs are staggering and are depleting agency funds, they're perceived as emergencies, and they're dealt with differently in the budget process. There's always money to cover emergencies. Legislators find ways to cover the costs, and publicly these wildfires might be perceived as an easy fix. After all, the thinking goes, these are fire-dependent forests. Let them burn so long as they don't burn something valuable, however you define what that might be. But don't forget our short fire ecology brief that Wally gave us. Are these wildfires consistent with the dynamics of these fire regimes, or do we just believe simplistically that fire is fire is fire, irrespective of the fire regime at hand? What really are the effects to the human environment of these wildfires? To water and soil and flora and fauna and air? With this fire burning at these intensities in this place at this time, what are the long-term effects that this wildfire might have? Unlike a so-called management action that requires NEPA, wildfires get a pass on these important questions. Many of our present environmental laws were enacted in an earlier era of cooler temperatures and more precipitation, when I believe disturbance ecology was not widely known and rarely a part of our thinking. These were well-intended laws, and don't get me wrong, at their basis they still are. They should not be somehow abolished. But in this new reality, we need to make certain that the interpretations, the policies, and the practices that these laws have spawned now don't unintentionally imperil the very values they were designed to protect. In this new reality where global warming and unconstrained growth at the interface and distressed, high-hazard, fire-dependent forests are converging, the environmental laws that frame land management decisions need to become more sophisticated with respect to the disturbance dynamics and the role of fire in these forests. Let me touch on our expectations for the land. They may often be predisposing some of the worst wildfires we're seeing today. We've been working at the Brookings Institution and evaluating the so-called megafire phenomenon. In analyzing 7 of this country's worst wildfires, we're discovering that many of the country's most destructive fires, to some extent, may be fires of our own making. In short interval fire-dependent forests, when we attempt to maximize hiding our thermal cover for big game, or maximize basal area growth for timber production, or maximize filtration capacity for watersheds, or maximize visual retention for recreation value, or even at the interface, maximize screening for homeowner seclusion, we are inadvertently adding the biomass that fuels today's worst fires. Restoration strategies, as Rob suggested, should aim to optimize resource outputs in ways that are consistent with these fire regimes, rather than maximize them in this new reality where risk is certain. There may not be a more important land management or land use challenge confronting the West lawmakers, policymakers, community leaders, and our citizens than the stewardship of fire-dependent forests and grasslands. And I make that distinction. We're not talking about a fire policy issue anymore. We're talking about a land management issue in a big way. Wildfires that once burned at lower intensities over fewer acres and burned mostly trees, burned hot, burned big. They kill, they consume homes, they damage critical watersheds, they disrupt lives. And although it looks pretty grim today, I'm reminded of Wally's projections. And if those are even half true for global warming and population demographics at the interface and the condition of fire-prone ecosystems, where's this crisis going? Urgency surrounds this issue. Restoration is the topic of this workshop. For fire-dependent forests, I believe it's ecological but also an economic imperative for the Rocky Mountain West. In this new reality, I think there's growing consensus that the region's economic viability will be tied directly to the condition of its wildlands and the fire-dependent forests that define its landscapes. But restoration at meaningful scales, we're not talking about 1,000 acres here and 200 acres there. Restoration at the scales that Dr. Covington is talking about aren't going to happen if we don't better understand and more fully embrace the ecology of this place. They're not going to happen until the laws and policies, plans, and practices that were enacted to protect this place yesterday are modified to sustain it tomorrow. And they're probably not going to happen at the scales we need if we insist on maximizing the bits and pieces of an ecosystem rather than optimizing the whole system's health and resilience and biodiversity. Given the urgency that surrounds this problem, we'd be wise to get focused on the ends rather than keep getting ourselves wrapped around the axle over the means and the arguments that might fight it or burn it or cut it or log it or leave it. Until we do, I believe that beliefs are going to trump facts, old habits will impede new ideas, emotions will rule reason, incredible science will get lost to the loudest shout of the day. Perhaps at all of our loss. Thank you.
Thank you, Jerry. We're supposed to take a break in about 15 minutes, but we've got time for questions, so just fire away.
Jerry, I was just going to ask you, we talked a little bit last night, I put up the NRC and had 2 good fire years, and I agree wholeheartedly with everything you said. I'm certainly not a long-time fire person. But I think our biggest challenge is how do we educate our local county commissioners, our local communities, our legislators, our policymakers quickly enough to have the mindset, and you alluded to it, that our mindset is not there. We've got a lot of work to do, we don't have a lot of time in order to get policymakers and funders, the local communities to understand just how serious this crisis is that we're facing. How do we do that? Do you have the magic answer, please?
I don't know that I do have the magic answer, but I think there's models around that would help us. The other day, again in the Missoulian, I think it's, people accuse me it's the only paper I read anymore. I don't read the Washington Post so much. Steve Running had an interesting piece talking about the stages of separation, Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, stages of death and dying, and how we go through these predictable stages of denial and anger and blame and arguing and so forth until we finally get to acceptance. And in that article, he talked about the steps that he's seen in trying to draw people's attention to this issue of global warming. I think there's some critical lessons there for us in this restoration problem and exactly how we do that. It's, as speakers today have talked about, it's not going to be easy, it's going to be fraught with difficulty, but there are examples around the West where good things are happening. One of the things that Wally and I were talking about last night that impedes progress in this area is a fundamental lack of comprehensive analysis that would describe the problem, array the projections. Wally's example up here showing the cost of treatment versus the benefits in terms of water and wildlife and forage production and so forth. We have not done a very good job of that. I think we're going to have to get serious about it. Even a few years ago when the timber wars were raging in this part of the country, the common perception was that, gosh, if we quit cutting timber, all these jobs are going to go away, this place is going to dry up, and my God, what will happen to the state's economy? It wasn't until people started looking at the benefits of recreation and tourism and some of the amenity values that define this region that people could finally get their arms around, well, gosh, maybe this is a solution worth seeking. If we're going to do well in restoration, I think we're going to have to get after the analysis in a more disciplined, more dispassionate way.
Jerry, I think you hit on something that's important. I work with a lot of private landowners, and a lot of them realize that if they don't do something with their forest, that amenity is going to be lost. And I think that that's one of the things that we need to be focusing on, is getting people to realize if we have stand replacement fires in these low elevation forests that historically didn't have them, a lot of the amenities that they now enjoy will be gone. And I think that's one of the things that needs to be focused on. Would you agree with that?
Certainly. A few years ago in 2000, I was the director here in the northern region, and it was the first time we had homeowners starting to call us down the Bitterroot. I don't care about my house, that damn thing's insured, just don't let that fire ruin the Bitterroot face. That's why I live here. But we have not quantified that. We've not assessed its value. We have not done the analysis that makes these kinds of difficult, contentious issues stand up.
Wally, Jerry, and Rob, you each talked about the need to redirect some of our federal dollars away from going into all this effort on fire suppression, where we need to find ways to use the available assets we have to try and stimulate this economy. If you had a $500 million bank account for each of you, where would you spend that money?
Well,
Keeping it on the topic at hand.
I guess what I would suggest with that, what I would do with that is obviously this collaboratively based prioritization of restoration treatments in the landscape. And two areas that emerge, I think, are breaking up landscape scale fuel continuity. so that you can limit the size of fires. And then protecting critical wildlife habitat. I think that, in trying to do a time travel approach to this, imagine that we could bring people here 100 years from 100 years into the future. I think those are the two elements, both dealing with large landscapes and then with critical habitats.
I'd take Wally's money that he's used, and I think would look at more development of markets for the utilization, so you can pay for some of the work that needs to be done in the future, as opposed to a lump sum that says, yeah, we're going to do work, and then where are we? Develop some infrastructure there that you really can continue with this after that money's gone.
Well, from personal experience with a $1.5 billion fire protection budget in the U.S., having the money and delivering the money are two different things. After the National Fire Plan, we saw the fuels portion of the fire budget go from roughly $50 million a year to about $200 million a year. But in a decentralized, functionally oriented organization like the Forest Service, governed by politics, where new money is available, every senator and every congressman in the country is going to want a piece of that. And pretty soon, your priority of short interval fire-dependent forests in the Intermountain West, where the largest, most destructive, most costliest wildfires are occurring, is getting spread all over the place. You know, a part of a restoration strategy has got to be political, and it's got to be aimed at not only securing the funds, but targeting those funds to the highest priority and having the political will to see that through.
Yeah, I would just say one thing I was wondering about is that one of the biggest challenges is that in our society, we don't like preventative measures. We don't, you know, I think the whole Katrina example, I think, resonates with our issue of restoration. You know, the Army Corps told Congress for years those levees were in danger. And it was just, well, we'll wait till whatever, you know, what happens, we'll deal with it. And I think what the current discussions, the Forest Service Society in Congress about, wait a minute, look at this fire suppression budget. I think it's a similar social phenomenon that, you know, we're more comfortable with spending the money to deal with the emergency than we are with saying, well, let's spend money on things we know could help reduce the probability of danger. And that's not any kind of an answer, but I think that getting around that orientation is much bigger than getting, you know, local communities, environmental organizations, and business guys to agree on where we're going to do restoration. It's a larger core value thing. I don't know what I'd be interested to see. You guys see it similarly, but I have no idea how to deal with that kind of.
Made worse, I think, by the absence of good analysis. You know, there was a fascinating hearing this last January where Mark Ray, the undersecretary, was yarded up to the Hill, and OMB's been very, very upset with the Forest Service over the amount of money that's spent fighting fire. And the hearing, the purpose of the hearing was, tell us, Mr. Ray, what the basis for all these costs are. It was interesting, his response was, he goes, you know, the same guys here today that are asking me this question are the same ones that this summer are going to be asking me how come they don't have all the air tankers and more heavy lift helicopters in their district or their state. The Katrina example is a good one, but for a lot of folks on the Hill, the lawmakers, the policymakers, until they have some analysis, some kind of rationale that'll stand scrutiny in their pocket, this problem is made a hell of a lot worse.
One thing that occurs to me is that Oregon has had comprehensive land use planning for statewide comprehensive land use planning until the last election for 20 years. And that comprehensive land use planning was designed primarily to keep subdivision out of productive farm and forest lands, so that we could have a farm and forest land farming. We obviously have a really different fire ecosystem, but we have a lot of fire dominant ecosystems west of the Cascades and south of the, in the Klamath-Siskiyou. And I wonder whether there is, even if you have seen any studies, I haven't, in Oregon, which look seriously at what, a place that has comprehensive land use planning compared to places that don't, and what the consequences of that are on fire. Because it seems to me, and obviously in Oregon it's uneven, some places have dealt with it by drawing their boundaries tightly and eliminating the sprawl, and other places there are, subdivisions of dead-end roads in the middle of the woods. But it strikes me that that could be extremely powerful for action at the state level. And I don't know whether you guys have seen anything like that or not.
I would just comment, after the 2003 fire seasons in Southern California, the Governor's Commission, or Governor commissioned a review of the fires, and some of us participated on that. It was revealing, looking even in Southern California, the differences between Ventura County and, say, San Diego County. 15 years ago or so, Ventura County finally got to the point where the cost of county fire suppression was breaking the bank. And they, over some very difficult political obstacles, enacted very strong state or county codes, fire-resistant roofing material, brush clearance standards, and that sort of thing. San Diego County, on the other hand, even though they'd had disastrous fires over the years, going all the way back to the Laguna fires, the orientation was, if we ever get in trouble, we'll just call the feds and they'll come and put it out. No need to bother about taxes and codes and that sort of thing. Ventura County in this 11 years has not lost a single home due to a wildfire where these controls have been put in place. Contrast that with San Diego County, who in one night lost 3,600 homes. Those kinds of comparative analyses, I think, are extraordinarily important and a part of the analysis that needs to be introduced to our lawmakers and our policymakers.
Here in the state of Montana, fires are breaking us. And we realize this time that we have a whole new budget piece that we're going to have to deal with year after year. And it looks like the coming biennium, we may deal with $80 million for fires. And this is a whole new hungry mouth to feed. We were lucky we had what some people call surplus this time. Actually, a lot of that money was slated to go back to tax relief, but somehow got lost in a little deal that was made. But you talk about, and I'm interested in the parallel to Katrina. The response to Katrina was slow, but there was a powerful response once it got on track. That's because people knew that Katrina was a disaster. And it was evident because of the people that lost homes and lives. You talk about the fire situation and the need for more comprehensive analysis. Maybe it needs to be simplified a little bit so that legislators and policymakers can understand it better. Katrina is happening in the West. It may have implications that are even far greater than the Katrina strategy and response. Isn't it time to do something about a catastrophe that is happening year after year after year?
I just wanted to mention in terms of making progress, particularly in growth management, being from Arizona, growth management doesn't really resonate in our legislature at all. And but one thing that we saw as we rolled out the governor's the governor's statewide strategy in public meetings is some very interesting bedfellows started emerging in those public meetings. And in Prescott, for example, we had Allstate a representative from Allstate Insurance come forward and express his desire and his company's desire to be involved in better controls in the WUI because of their liability and exposure on that front. I think if we get that bedfellow in the room with the legislature and also the rural municipal firefighters and their union, which have expressed interest, then we've got some pretty interesting people showing up at the legislature who tends to want to shut down any sort of effort to manage growth. And so I think it comes down to creating some very different but perhaps more robust first strategies, to not using the conventional approaches to try and fix this problem.
I think it's time, take one more and then we'll break.
I guess I'd like to make one comment I work in more stream restoration types of projects, but an interesting parallel that is going on with what I'm hearing with the forest restoration projects is the lack of analysis or monitoring of what is working and communicating that to people. And I think as if you're talking restoration economy as a whole, there needs to be that commitment to looking at those, what is going to work or what is working. We can go out and restore a stream and say, yep, there's more trout in this stream, but if we don't look at it long term, what is that trout population in that stream 10 years from now, 15 years from now? Has it actually gone back to what it was pre-restoration? We don't do that type of monitoring and that analysis, and I see that same parallel here, and I think that's a very important thing to try to look at. And going to a lot of technical conferences, that's one of the major issues that people talk about, is the lack of monitoring and analysis of the restoration activities that are taking place.
Great. Thank you. Kathy, do we come back in half an hour? Half an hour. Half an hour, okay.